from the coalface to the most senior level, always saw compliance as an imposition, a distraction. It's nothing to do with me. I would never take a bribe. All of those sort of things. And I realised we had to do something different. And bear in mind, we're talking about training, as I say, 250,000 people. All of that training takes effort and time if you're going to do it. And what had happened historically is that, let's say 30-40% of people who are trained, good enough. We'll leave it at that. Yeah, it's good enough. We were not going to have a good enough approach going forward.
Joining us today, Keith Reid, former Group Compliance and Ethics Director, British Telecom, and author of The Unconventional Compliance Officer. Keith Reid was formerly General Manager, Supply Chain Integrity for British Telecom's $6 billion supply chain, before becoming the company's Group Director of Compliance and Ethics, with responsibility for compliance, ethics and regulatory risk management. He covered 150,000 employees and contractors operating in some 176 countries. He is a past winner of the Compliance Register's Best Compliance Officer Award, when he also won the Best Compliance Company Award. He was subsequently the subject of a full-page Daily Telegraph national press article, Compliance and Science. Since leaving BT, he has worked with a range of major household name companies and leading solution providers in the compliance and ethics field, including Global Advice Network, LRN, and Conversant OneTrust. He has an innovative and practical approach to compliance and ethics, and his recently published book, The Unconventional Compliance Officer, provides a raft of new and highly original ways of addressing what are the universal challenges for compliance and ethics officers. Welcome, Keith. How are you?
All good. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this. It's very good of you. Very kind.
I'm excited. I should let everyone know that we already have a history, of course. We've spoken together, we've written together, and I have so many questions to ask you that I realise, even though I've known you quite a long time, I've never got into. And one of the things that I was really puzzling over when I was researching for the podcast is, how the hell did you get into it in the first place, this gig with compliance and ethics? How far back are we going?
Don't. It's a long story, but for me, it shows how chance and also being prepared to take a chance kicks in. So I was a British Telecom lifer, career, and so on, had a very good career and so on. And then at one point I took over running British Telecom payphones. Now you see a payphone at every corner. Most of them are now homes for books or defibrillators, all good stuff.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was a really serious issue. So 2 little boys had died in a fire because the payphone didn't work. Nobody could call 999 and so on. Questions were asked in Parliament, etc., etc. It was a really serious issue. Payphones were on the headlines of every newspaper and so on. So the decision was taken by the company to set it up as a standalone division, try and make a profit, obviously. But payphones had never, ever made a profit. The maintenance costs outweighed the money that was coming through the slots. And cut a long story short, we turned that around. We made a profit. It was applauded from all quarters and so on, internally and externally. But what happened, we were then the victim of a sentencing decision in the courts, which said that if you went armed to rob a bank, which was what happened at the time a lot, you would have a very heavy sentence. So the thieves, organised crime, switched to payphones because they could rob 12 payphones in a night, make roughly the same money as they would for a bank robbery, and unlikely to get caught, etc., etc. So that threw me very briefly into logistics and having to get lots of spare parts and so on and so forth. And one day I was on a train and I suddenly looked out the window and there was a scrapyard right by the railway line. You've seen lots of scrapyards by railway line. I suddenly saw a lot of our parts, components, all stacked in the scrapyard. How did I get in there? Short story was, I started looking into that, doing the numbers, doing the analytics that said, we've bought 10,000 of these, but we can only find 2,000. We've only used etc., etc. And in it, without being big-headed, it was in advance of its time. Now, environment, all that sort of thing, recycle, reuse, rolls off the tongue. At the time, it didn't. So what I did was did all that work to keep payphones running and so on, get it back in profit, etc. But that came to the attention of some of the seniors, the board members of BT, and that led on to me becoming general manager supply chain integrity for the whole company. 6 billion supply chain, quite a challenge. So I often say, I think that's how most of my hair went anyway. And then, unbeknown to me, 5 years on from that, the company was having real problems over compliance and ethics. Because there was a big competitive telecoms industry. All the competitors were complaining that we were breaking the rules. Lots of things going on. Again, questions in Houses of Parliament, all in the press. I suddenly get a call on a Thursday night to say, would I have a meeting with the CFO, soon to be the CEO of the company. Given where I started from, I was quite a shock, And by Tuesday night, I was the Deputy Director, then Director of Compliance and Ethics for British Telecom. So 250,000 people, 176 countries. Quite a shock. That's how it came about. Sorry for the long story. That's how it happened.
No, I think that's great. And do you know what strikes me talking to you is that you've made a career about thinking unconventionally about things, haven't you, basically? And what do you think that comes from? I mean, where's the thinking? I mean, it's the outside the box thing, isn't it? But where does that, have you always been like it? I mean, are your parents like it? Where's that from?
It's interesting to say that. My parents left school very, very young. I mean, they left school, I won't tell you, but they left very, very young for various reasons and so on. And when I went to school, I didn't do very well at school at all. But there wasn't a qualification in ideas. There wasn't a qualification in, thinking outside the box and so on. And I still get upset about it now. I left school, not best circumstances. My parents moved, and my dad took a wrong turn in one night. Came across a college. I went to that college, never looked back. So just that chance of moving house, my father taking a wrong turning because he didn't know the area and so on, went to a college. There was a lecturer there. 15 minutes gave me more confidence than I'd had.
Oh, wow.
So it still gets me. Yeah.
No, but it's a wonderful story, and I think it's one that really resonates with me. I mean, my daughter, I think I've spoken on the podcast before about the fact that she's neurodiverse. She's got dyslexia, she's got dyscalculia, she's got ADHD, and I've noticed that she's really smart with thinking in that way, different thinking. And I think capturing that or finding what we're good at, it really interests me. And I think from a leadership perspective, thinking of all the leaders listening to this podcast, that's how we identify our teams. It's how we play to our strengths, all of that. And I think you've looked at things. I love the way you look at the pull and push. Talk to us a little bit about that, because I think that's played a huge part in how you approach things as well.
So obviously, for the bulk of my career, I was the person on the receiving end of all this compliance training and stuff, etc. I never had time to do it. Never really wanted to do it. Never, even though I was a fairly senior guy, I never thought it was really important, etc., etc. Suddenly, the seesaw switched the other way. I'm on the other side of that coin, and I realised that everybody, from the coalface, to coin a phrase, from the coalface to the most senior level, always saw compliance as an imposition, a distraction. It's nothing to do with me. I would never take a bribe. All of those sort of things. And I realised we had to do something different. Bear in mind, we're talking about training, as I say, 250,000 people. All of that training, takes effort and time if you're going to do it. And what had happened historically is that, let's say 30, 40% of people who are trained, good enough. We'll leave it at that. Yeah, it's good enough. We were not going to have a good enough approach going forward. And that's what
you got it up to 99%.
I did, yeah. Yeah, we did a lot of good sort of publicity, got the message out there why it was important. And then when people didn't do it for, we really, really focused on driving it home that they had to do this. And what I had a repertoire of compelling cases, as I called them. I said, this is why we're doing it. So, compelling examples of things like, you've heard me talk about this before, a young 13-year-old attempted to commit suicide as a consequence of his father being bullied. all of those sort of things. So when you start bringing these messages home to people, why compliance and ethics and all the things we were talking about are important, people start to wake up and start to be more responsive. But I also felt that the question for me is, what's in it for me? Nobody had ever addressed that. I've been to thousands like you of, or hundreds certainly, of compliance events, the what's in it for me question. So what I decided to do was to say we were going to turn push into pull. We were going to say, right, every compliance officer in the world spends their time pushing. You push out training, you push out reminders, you push out escalations, communications, policies. The list goes on. What's that lead to? Compliance fatigue and pushback. So we were going to turn all that push, which is uphill for you, for me as the compliance officer, into downhill. People want it. They really want, this is important to them. And that's how we turn compliance push into pull. You may say that's a great idea, Keith, but what's the reality? Well, we created a compliance passport. Do your training, you get your passport. The passport, and I often tell the story. I was sitting working somewhere, and I had people walk down the corridor and say, "I got my passport today." They were really proud. 5 minutes ago, they couldn't have really cared less. But by putting it in that wrap, suddenly they realised it was important, and it was important to them. That was the big difference.
Talk to us a bit about that. So I know you mention it in the book, but was it a sort of an incentive program effectively? Is that how the passports took off?
I mean, it's a really good question, Sarah, but to be honest, it can be what you want, and it doesn't have to be much, because my ad hoc analysis says that about 40, maybe more than 40% of people want to get a passport because it's available. They want it because they want it. Yeah. They want to be part of the club. They want to say, yeah, I've got my part, and all of that sort of thing. So that immediately takes a big swathe of people out because they do it because they think it's the right thing. Then there's a swathe of people you might have to sort of persuade, which is about, well, if you don't have your passport, you can't apply for promotions. You can't do this, or etc. You can do what you want, what works for you, what works for your organisation. You can put all the passport holders, successful passport holders, in a lottery, for a modest price, all of that sort of thing, modest incentive. You can do what you want. It doesn't matter, but the end result is the same. That's what you want, people engaged.
I remember you saying that, for example, around conflicts of interest, that everybody sees it as a negative, but you sort of turned that around, didn't you? And you made it into a compliance.
Yes. Yeah, I mean,
Tell us about that as well. I love this one.
I think, I used to see people every time, we used to go out to them and say, declare conflicts of interest, all that sort of thing. And there were 27 responses why they wouldn't do it. None of your business, I'm not doing it, I haven't got a conflict, even if I did, I wouldn't. You know all the all the reasons. I suddenly realised that in a company of our size, there were a lot of people, I mean, doing good things. So, for example, there were people who held important roles, key roles, senior in charities, like we're doing part-time and all of those. So all of a sudden, all this conflicts of interest, which was essentially negative and so on, I said, well, let's make it more positive. If you're doing something for a charity, tell us about it. All of those. And ultimately what that turned into was a win-win-win, because the people were proud of what they were doing. They got to tell us. We got to know about it. And therefore we could say as a company, we've got 10,000 people doing, 50,000 hours a year of charity work. And also we teamed up with some of those charities to work with them. So everybody won. We'd taken a negative to a positive. And that's what I bang on about sometimes.
It just strikes me, listen to you speak. I mean, I've thought many times that it's almost like a marketing role, often being a chief ethics and compliance officer, because it's about the messaging. And obviously making that message resonate with people so that they can relate to it, really. It makes sense to them. I mean, are there other examples where you think you've kind of spoken at a level where people really listen?
I think that, compelling stories is one of the things. I think that the danger is that a lot of people will turn off as soon as you mention compliance, ethics, legal, all of that sort of thing. They're switched off. It's nothing to do with me. So, as I said a moment ago, I use some compelling cases. the case I referred to a moment ago, a guy was bullied by his manager. The guy who was bullied had a heart attack, which was bad enough of itself. Yeah, should never happen on work zone. But what happened then, his son, his 13-year-old son, thought because his dad wouldn't be able to work, he would have to leave school, and the 13-year-old son tried to commit suicide. When you tell people that, to say, this is why whistleblowing, learning about whistleblowing, this is why anti-retaliation is important, people start to wake up. When you start talking to people about a railway disaster, where a guy, one of the biggest railway disasters that occurred, was because a guy had worked 13 consecutive 7-day weeks. But the problem was he'd worked for 2 different companies and neither knew about each other. When you start bringing that home to people, you say, we're not doing this without good reason. And they start to really wake up. So although it is marketing, I agree, it's about those sort of messages, those key messages.
And do you think one of the things I know we've both spoken about before is values, but do you think your personal values have influenced how you approach things?
I,
You've got a big heart, Keith. Anyone who knows you knows. No.
I, I mean, I think so, but I think that, I think I think the key issue with compliance is really, I mean, people have suddenly said to me sometimes, why did you get the job? And I think the company, in my case, wanted somebody with energy, with enthusiasm, with determination, and also was prepared, to look out, to kind of phrase, outside the box, and also do the analytics to say, this can't be right. These numbers say this, but we're not doing that, and so on. Perhaps not answering the question, but I think that's about energy and enthusiasm carries a program which can often not be well received by your colleagues and peers and so on.
I want to pick up on what you just said, actually, because interestingly, I read a PwC report from last year that said that 75% of compliance professionals say that AI will be critical in detecting fraud by 2026. And I know that you are a big proponent of looking at the data from all different departments, not just maybe a compliance survey or whatever. Talk to us a little bit about how that's originated. I mean, is that because you were looking in those other departments at more data-driven things and you've seen the value, or? Right.
Yes, again, a good question. I think coming from so eventually when I did get an education and all of that sort of thing, a lot of it was heavily mathematics biased and so on. And then working in payphones, it was all about numbers, that work. There were only 3 factors that drove whether a payphone was operational at any one time. Yeah. Was it working? Did we know about it? And how quickly could you fix it? It was quite hard maths. That was all the rest of it was smoke and mirrors.
Yes.
And that taught me about the value of data and also knowing what the data is and so on. And you've heard me talk also about, I talk a lot about disparate data, because what tends to happen is companies are organized in silos. And often what happens is the data from those silos never gets compared. And one of the examples I use a lot is to say I did an analysis of, let's say, visitors to our main procurement building, on the basis that if there are visitors from vendors and suppliers are arriving at 11 o'clock onwards or 4 o'clock onwards, the odds are they are taking people out to lunch or to dinner.
Makes sense.
So did that analysis. I then compared those visitor arrivals with what was being reported through our gifts and hospitality or gifts, travel and entertainment process. First time I did this, there was a 90% discrepancy. So what that meant was, although I could say, yeah, we've got a process and it works and we're getting reports, it was 90% discrepancy just by comparing 2 disparate sets of data. Same with retaliation. You've heard me talk about, you know this, where what I simply did was said, okay, let's look at all the reports we get. Let's look at 100 reports and let's look what happened to those people afterwards. And my family have never forgotten it. You've heard me say this. Sitting there, I'm watching one eye on the television, and you could see straight away the retaliation pattern. I mean, it was so shocking. But when we were doing follow-up with people, what I'd found was that, you do a follow-up with a reporter and they just want to get you off the phone. They want to get rid of you because they want to forget it. That data But then I could say to them, "But hold it, but you didn't get a pay rise last year, or you didn't get a." Well, no. Well, why was that? You know, and so on. And they start opening up, and that's why I talk. We've spoken about the multiplier effect. You often find that there can be a multiplier, 4 or 5 to 1, of retaliation events that the data won't disclose, but that's what people reveal when you talk to them.
I think retaliation, as we've both spoken about, is a really tricky one because the nature of the beast is that it's behind closed doors, that it's not overt
Sure.
9 times out of 10. It's interesting, isn't it? Because when you look at companies who've used data a lot, and a Harvard Business Review, again from last year, basically identified that programs that were data-driven compliance programs, so looking at data a lot, were reducing regulatory breaches by 30%. But I think what you seem to focus on more, although it's obviously data-driven, is these sort of anomalies in the trends
Yes.
that the disparate things
Yes.
you're talking about. What is the most effective way then to start measuring these things? Because casting your eye over data and seeing anomalies, that's one way. Looking at, advanced AI and data-driven trends to get those regulatory breaches down is another. But is there some sort of, I don't know, amalgamation of both? I mean, what if you're a leader with a limited budget, where should you be focusing your energies, do you think, Keith?
I think what you've got is you've got a three-tier approach. Essentially, there is a core sort of tier of what I would call the standard compliance type measures, compliance and ethics type measures. And those, you can find anywhere and so on. I think there's a second tier then, which is the sort of stuff that I talk about, which is the disparate data. I've written stuff on this and so on, which says the second tier is let's compare. Let's say, as I've said a moment ago, visitor logs with gifts and hospitality. So you may not be able to do that in every company, but you can do it in a lot of companies and so on. And then there's a third tier, which I think comes under that broad heading of, you've heard me talk about, is how far would you go? So things that you can trigger to almost create a data test situation. And the how far would you go exactly? So the question I pose to people, as you know, is how far would you go to achieve a compliant and ethical organisation? So, one of the things that I did was sent an invitation to people who not 6 months before had their bribery training. I sent them an invitation to a day at the races. A third of those people just accepted the invitation. No questions, no issues, and so on. Lots of things like that. I sent everybody in procurement one year a bottle-shaped box with a bottle of water in it to make the weights feel about right. And in that, they had a copy of our code of conduct. They never forgave me for sending that out, but they never forgot it. And anecdotally, we reckon that investment in a few bottles of water and a few envelopes and all of that sort of thing, and the copies of the code of conduct, was worth about 3 years worth of training. So again, there's data opportunities that come out of all of that. So as I said, that's that third tier, which you can develop measures which are specific to your organisation, or better than some of mine and so on, I'm sure.
Because you speak in the book about a sort of mystery shopper approach. Tell us a bit more about that. Is that sort of the tip of the iceberg, the bottle?
Well, we had lots of complaints, as I touched on earlier, from the regulator. I mean, Ofcom were then and still are described as the most capable and competent regulator in Europe, possibly the world. So these were capable people. And we were getting lots of complaints from our competitors saying that we were breaking the rules, et cetera, et cetera. So we did a lot of mystery shopping around where we could have potentially broken the rules. And when we started doing it, the results were shocking. But the problem is we'd had 20 years of regulation, and despite 20 years of regulation and 20 years of training and 20 years of, and so on, it was allowed to happen. And that's what, I was determined we were going to change. And that's what we did change. I think you've seen a quote from Ofcom after 18 months. So what I stress to people is it's not a 5-year, 10-year program. After 18 months, Ofcom was saying, we've experienced a significant reduction in our workload. This is because better relationship, da 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 da, and so on. So to get that from the regulator, the most competent, capable regulator, and so on, was quite a.
I feel like I'm listening to you speak that it's a lot to do with building trust as well internally. I feel like over time you became kind of a trusted resource for this outside the box thinking or impactful training or whatever it is the messaging was. Do you think, thinking from a leadership perspective, that fostering this culture where Ofcom results speak for themselves, where retaliation reduces and you've got fewer of those stories to tell, what do you put that down to? Was it a relationship building thing with trust, or
Yeah, I think relationships come into it a lot because obviously, any company of any size, but a company of the size that I worked in, getting people over here to do things that you want and so on is no mean task. You can't just, for example, let's say one of the things that we did was about putting messages on payslips at the time about compliance. But of course, there's about a dozen stakeholders involved in that decision and so on. And that's not perhaps the best example, but there's a dozen stakeholders. They all have costs, they all have other objectives, etc., etc. And I gave a talk a few weeks ago at an event that was loosely related to the Grenfell Tower disaster, and it seemed to be very well received at the time, and so on. But just like with some of the Post Office Horizon, all those cases are all about perverse incentives. Incentivizing people to do the wrong thing. So what I try to do is to incentivize people, get people in a variety of ways to do the right thing.
reading in, I think it was Forbes, that 61% of people globally believe that business leaders purposely try to mislead by saying things they know are false. And I thought, wow, that's a big statistic, especially as the Howe Institute, who's led obviously by Dev Seidman, who we've both worked with, have identified that 93% of employees believe moral leadership is more urgent than ever. So you've got, on the one hand, everyone very mistrustful, and on the other hand, everyone saying that this is really important.
Yeah.
I feel like when I'm listening to you speak about the trust that you built within BT and externally with even the regulator, do you think that's still possible in this kind of distrusting environment we find ourselves now in? Because that was what, over 10 years ago.
I think
Or do you think it's the same?
No, I think you have to focus on trust. I think that the question is how successful it's going to be, how much effort you have to do, and whether you can put enough effort in to deliver that. But you have to keep focusing on that. Personally and professionally, I think that personally trying to be straightforward with people and so on. I mean, I was looking at something yesterday, and it says here about seeing and saying things for what they are. So that's what I think is a key issue. The session that we did about retaliation, I've done that for other people and so on, and one audience in the US said, this is the first time we've ever encountered this sort of level of data, truth, and so on. We didn't know all this. So
No, it's quite confronting when you set it out for people.
yeah, well,
But
and if you crank through it, then people start to understand. And once they start to understand, again, the seesaw analogy, it suddenly starts to come your way. People are on board.
it's a balancing act often, isn't it? For obviously the regulatory requirements, business agility, and then sort of seeing the key factors like trust and like explaining from the storytelling or whatever how this is impacting on people. How can leaders navigate this? How can they balance that increasingly regulatory landscape against needing to be agile for the business?
I think sometimes this where people don't speak to the truth and all that sort of thing. I think sometimes that's based on poor data, misinformation. You've heard me say that one of the pieces of analysis I did was what our cost per employee per annum of compliance was. What's your cost of compliance is a phrase that I use. And at the time we were spending 22, I think it was, pounds, but 30, 40, 50 pounds. I mean, I looked up yesterday, all the competition law fines, all £50,000 per employee. That's just one fine once. And so, but of course, boards, in my experience, boards of all the companies that I've worked with and so on over the years since leaving BT and so on, they don't know what they're spending. They have no idea. What they do believe is that compliance is expensive, it's intrusive, it's the business prevention department, and that drives some of their decision making and some of their approaches. Once you start dispelling those myths, you've heard me talk about destroying the myths. Once you start to say, would you want to spend £50 on getting it right, or do you want to spend £50,000 on getting it wrong? People start to wake up, and people's whole approach changes.
And it's still shocking, really, that they do need it spelt out like that, because we know last year was something like companies paying a record $9.2 billion for compliance-related fines.
Yeah.
And so even on the monetary side of things, never mind, we now have data that shows that if you invest in your people, in training your people, and in compliance and ethics generally, you're going to see improvements in metrics like innovation,
Sure.
like employee retention, which I hear so much about. People are struggling to retain talent. So why do you think that messaging seems so slow to translate? Because you're right. I'm still hearing that compliance is a cost center, not
I mean,
a shield.
you've heard me say, I mean, literally, I've travelled to pretty much most parts of the world. I've spoken, around the world, and in all those years, so more than 10 years, of asking the same question of people. How much do you, and these are all compliance officers, general counsels, but how much do you spend per employee per annum on compliance?
Just don't know.
And I've only ever had one answer once with somebody who clearly showed that they'd done the same analysis. I think I had one other answer which says, I know what the number is, but I'm not prepared to share it, which was interesting.
Let's not talk about that.
Yeah, no, that's good luck with that then. But that's the only, so that's the, literally, I mean, without a word of a lie, that's the only two responses I've ever had. And when I pounce on audiences and say, right, hands up, who knows what you spend per employee? But there's all the shuffling of feet and looking at the floor and all that sort of thing. So if they don't know, you I won't say that word, you're guaranteed to know that their seniors, their boards, don't know either, because they never thought about it.
So that's the disconnect. That's maybe if you're a leader sitting at home now and you are, maybe you're in charge of a compliance program, or maybe you are thinking around why is compliance even important to my company? Maybe that's the place to start, is
Yeah.
to figure out what you can invest.
Exactly.
Because if we know that things like talent retention are linked to this, where I'm struggling is why is the investment so hard to get? Because I think you're saying, well, it's about information. If we know that compliance is costing X, then we can see the discrepancy, if you like, on what it could cost. But what about what we gain from having, an ethics-based compliance program? I don't know why that messaging doesn't translate, because there's empirical data now. So
Yeah.
what do you think that's about?
So what I do is some work, which essentially, I've looked at the cost of compliance and so on, and really what that does, it opens up a raft of opportunities, because people can then say, well, if I spent 10% more or 10% less or whatever, what does that mean? What does that mean for a program? But at least then you're having a proper consideration. But also then it's the positives that come out of compliance. I deal with a lot of procurement activities and so on. And a lot of companies, want policies, want process, want, and so on. I'm a trustee of a very, very small charity organisation and so on. And some of the stuff there, they've got policies this long and so on. But without those policies, you can't bid for public procurement, you can't bid for major company tenders, all of that sort of stuff. So again, it's that what's it cost us? How can we improve that, develop it, perhaps reduce it, perhaps increase it? But what do we get out of it? In my experience, very, very few people do that analysis. Very, very, very few people do the analysis of cost, and very, very few people do the benefit analysis. Because, after all, compliance is a business prevention department, isn't it? Gets in the way of everything. Why would I do that? It's a pain. That's what you've got to destroy the myths. That's why destroying the myths is so important.
And what's the single most successful way you've destroyed a myth, do you think?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think never letting up on it, really, which is to get that message out to anybody and everybody who needs to know it and so on. I mean, I used to sit in team meetings. I hear managers say, "Yeah, well, we don't make a report to the hotline. We deal with all that stuff ourselves. We deal with it in house." And destroying those myths. Once you start to really get on the front foot with stuff like that, people would start to understand why compliance ethics is A, so important, B, it's not the business prevention department, and C, it offers fantastic value for money, done well, done right.
And on that, you just touched on whistleblowing. Talk to us a bit about Veronica and how that came about.
Well, yeah, starting the compliance. I mean, at the time we had an internal hotline, and it was staffed by all the calls went to our security help desk, which often many of those people were ex-police and so on. No disrespect intended at all, ex-police and so on. So, and their job was as a call handler, take the call in, log it and so on, etc. And one morning I was getting ready here, and I decided on the spur of the moment I was going to make 6 test calls to our hotline. So I did 6 test calls, including one in French, and I only ever, as all designed to come back to me as the chief compliance officer. I only ever heard back from 2 of those calls.
Wow.
And the French one was just a complete disaster. And that's what triggered us to go to a third party. But as part of that, I realised that making a hotline call, a whistleblower, is such a big step, such an enormous step for people. I mean, it's all the years I was at school, and I wasn't all the years I was at school, you never went to see the teacher, you never, all of those sort of things. You're trying to undo what's been instilled in children, in people rather, since they were young. So one of the things was to give compliance a face. I had this ethos about giving compliance a face, and Veronica was one. So rather than I'm making a hotline, but I'm going to call the whistleblower, it was about I'll email Veronica. I'll report it to Veronica. Completely different approach. Completely different. And there are a number of companies out there who've adopted a similar approach.
And how did it work for BT? I mean, what did the data show you? Did you do more test calls?
Yeah, I mean the data show. I mean the test calls triggered the fact that we had to do something better. Rather than have it go to a hotline that was to a desk that was really geared around security issues, and then that led on to getting a third party in, who had much more, were much more dedicated to managing a hotline and all the
different languages and all of this,
and also case management and so on. So all of that was much better, and the people obviously are dealing with. You see, what really irritates me sometimes, I listen to people and so on, and there's an assumption that a whistleblower hotline report is a transaction. He did this, she did this, I'm upset, this and so on. It's a transaction, but it's not. If you've ever listened to recordings of hotline calls and whistleblower reports and so on, people are sometimes sobbing, absolutely bereft, absolutely destroyed by what's happened. You think about the guy who was bullied by his manager, who then his son, 13-year-old son tried to commit suicide. These are dreadful situations. So assuming that it's a pure transaction, I want to report this. This happened. It happened on Friday, the 15th of March, and so on.
So
Just
there's no sensitivity there around the courage that it would have taken to
correct.
call out that issue.
Yeah, I mean that's
So, yes, there's no sensitivity around, the bravery or the courage it would have taken to make that call or the issues around it.
and that's why things like contemporaneous reporting, which are starting to starting to be implemented now, and so on, are so important. It means that I might not feel confident today about reporting something because my manager, who's responsible for it, is still there, but I might be more confident when he or she has moved on. But also for you as the company, if the hotline company or whoever it is reports the fact that they've had 5 related reports, but you haven't seen them yet, but be aware there's obviously something going on in the Edinburgh department or the London department or whatever. Contemporaneous reporting, I think, is a really crucial development.
Yeah, and it's one of those pieces of disparate data again that you were talking about,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
So, thinking around handling these crises as they arise. So, say you have a department and you've got an issue there, or Ofcom have said they've got an escalating number of complaints or whatever. What lessons have you learned from those incoming crises and how you handle them?
We had I'd say that, to give you an example, we had a murder case where very briefly a guy was murdered in a gangland dispute. Killer went to prison. That would normally be the end of the matter. Unfortunately, the friends of the guy who was murdered vowed they would go after the killer's parents. The parents were offered witness protection, which they declined because, as you know, witness protection means no friends or family for the rest of your life. They decided to buy a house that was out of the way in the UK, keep their heads down and hope it would pass. Unfortunately, 2 British Telecom employees revealed the address from the telephone records, and both the mother and father were killed. Um, so, I use that as an example to say, you may think this is compliance, this is ethics, this is telecoms, but that's the human cost when it goes wrong. And I use that as a reminder to it. So I think when you hit crises, of that nature, perhaps not as severe as that, um, all I would say is that you can only work through them. You can only gather the information, you work through them. Hopefully, you have built in place the processes and the people to deal with those crises and so on, and work through them, to resolution. Some of them can be genuinely shocking. Some of them can be severely business affecting, and so on. But you just work through them. But as I say, that example of the murder I've given is one where I think everybody, despite all your efforts, all the efforts to train, educate, and so on, but then when you dig into this below the surface of it, I mean, these 2 guys have revealed you know, were petrified, but they also didn't have the confidence to talk to their manager because they were petrified. So the whole thing goes around the circle. And one of the things that really triggered me to do is to try and break that circle. We spoke a moment ago about whistleblowing.
Mm.
If you accept what I say, that it's such a big step to make a whistleblowing report. If you've got if you've got criminal threats at you and so on, what would you do? And that's the dilemma those guys faced. They had no idea that the consequences of their actions would be a double murder. And I know, that one of the guys involved, was physically sick when he found out. But that can be the consequences, very extreme, fully accept, of a compliance failure. And that's why, you have to have the right people and the right processes in place. And also, frankly, you have to have built the foundations on which you can address those types of crises when they occur.
And what is a good foundation? Is it the team? Is it what is it?
Yeah, I think it's all of that. I think it's a team. I think it's communications. I think as well, it's about, I think as well, it's about having the confidence to say, we've done the right things and we can only work through this one step at a time. And bear in mind, I mean, I can remember giving a talk in the BT Tower to all of our competitors about compliance, and they were absolutely, they were very they were very critical of our compliance performance. This is, not long after I'd taken the job and so on. So you have to just, and I wrote down here, you have to have a thick skin. Yeah, one of the key ingredients of being able to deal with crises and so on is having a thick skin. You have to deal with it because it won't always go right. Despite everything you do, it won't always go right.
Yeah, because you'll still have people do bad things or people who've had bad things happen to them.
Yeah.
What do you think the biggest upcoming challenge, though, if you're looking at it in a more generic way on the compliance and ethics landscape, or even on the leadership landscape, really? If you were a leader or if you were a chief ethics and compliance officer now, what should you be worried about coming up?
I, I, I think there are a raft of challenges, particularly around AI. I think there's a raft of challenges around, under the generic heading of technology. I think as well that what's going to happen is that increasing, I'm dealing with something to do with the failure to prevent bribery for an organisation now and so on. So every week there's more different legislation and so on. Yeah, so all of that, those are all the challenges that are going to be, I think, regular for organisations now. I think as well that and you're very familiar with this, but I think the use of personal devices, all of those are really some of the,
There's a lot of exposure, you think, around
I think so, yeah.
tech.
And I think as well there's this is not so I've really given much thought about and so on, but for a variety of reasons, there's probably, so for example, in my old company, the annual turnover of employees, the annual churn of employees was about 4%, which is low. That's because a lot of people like me were there for a career. But once you start having high levels of turnover, which most companies do now, I mean, my son has been, with a multitude of companies and in a multitude of countries. All of that brings risk, and those are the sort of challenges I think for companies right now. So I think one, technology. I think secondly, legislation. I think thirdly, churn, risk related to employees. I think fourthly as well, that without speaking out of turn, I think often compliance officers need to take a step back and really think about what their risks are and what they could do to address them. Because if this is any measure, I'm not saying it is, I attend a lot of compliance events and it's the same things that are being spoken about. So really what I'm saying is I'm not entirely sure whether necessarily all those risks are being addressed right now.
Because you're thinking that if they were being addressed over time, or then you'd hear less about them because
Well, either you'd hear less about them or you'd hear more about them in terms of people saying this is what we did and this was a successful program and so on. But at the moment, we're in no man's land, or no person's land in the middle, which is I don't hear that, but I also don't. Yeah, I don't hear either side.
But why do you think that is? I mean, there's not enough effort. I feel like the expectation is higher, though, from business
Correct.
as well. So, I mean, people couldn't be trying harder, working harder, and there's more studies around behaviour. And
Sure.
so why do you think that we're still in Groundhog Day with some of the topics?
You made me smile because I had a call from a lifetime friend last night. I first met when I was 16, and she's now the secretary for a bowls club, retirement bowls club, all that stuff. And she we spent half hour on the phone last night talking about data privacy to do with a WhatsApp group she's setting up. So, what we do, compliance and ethics, permeates all parts of life. And so I'm not asking you a question, but it did make me smile that obviously this sort of thing is uppermost in a lot of people's minds. But in business for companies, I think we have to do more. And I think done well, I think you can make people realise, all the stakeholders realise the benefits. If it's not done well, then again you revert to type, which is the business prevention department and so on. Not sure I've answered your question, but I just...
No, you haven't. Knowing you as well as I do, I think you've got a lot more to do in this area. But if you were looking back over, the last 3 decades of working in this space, what do you hope your legacy in this field, or in any case, will be? What do you think?
I just hope that some of the stuff I put in the book, I wrote the book because I thought there were some, even if I say it myself, thank you very much. Yes. I wrote the book because I thought, without being big-headed, I thought there were some ideas in there that I'd never heard anybody else talk about. So I thought I would get them out there. I did a session for a big multinational global engineering company the other day in London, and I rattled through some of the things, and I said, this is great ideas, so it's rewarding. So I think I'd like my legacy, in the event that I do leave a legacy, it would be some of those ideas, at least, if not being adopted, at least working into people's thinking. That's all.
Yeah, because it's inspirational to think about things from a different perspective, and that's what the book offers, I think.
Yes.
And last but not least, because our time's drawing to a close now, sadly, if you don't mind, I've got a question that I ask everybody who joins the podcast. And I am really interested to hear your answer to this because of all the reasons we've just spoken about and your unconventional thinking. So if you could create a leader's survival kit, what would you put in it?
Okay, so that's quite a challenging question. Okay,
I like to think so.
Yes, I was, off the top of my head, I think, I mean, I remember doing something for somebody where I put a fire alarm button in the box and so on, in case of emergency, press here and so on.
Oh, yeah.
It was just a wind up, really, but it was just a. But I mean, I often think, leaders emergency. That's what you need. In case of emergency, press here. I think it's a very good question because I think in terms of tangible things, I think what I would put in there is I often hear about presidents and all that where they write, and prime ministers always leave a note for their successor. In that leadership, I would put in that box about things about you'll need to have a thick skin. 1, 2, it will not always go right for you. Recognise that and move on. I think thirdly, be prepared. Coming back to your question earlier, be prepared to speak your mind. Don't necessarily adopt what might be the popular view and so on.
Be unpopular maybe then.
Yeah, I think fourthly would simply be never forget the data. And fifthly, always be prepared to experiment, take a chance. And if it doesn't work, go back, try something else.
Because we learn more from our mistakes sometimes than we do.
Not everything's going to work. I've seen companies, I experimented with a whole raft of things of how to communicate with our wider workforce. 100,000 people in vans, fixing phones and all that sort of thing. Experimented with all manner of things like that. And things like glasses cloths, okay? Most of the people are going to be wearing safety goggles all the time. So what do? You put the compliance message on the glasses cloth so they get it out of their pocket 10 times a day, they wipe their glasses and they read a compliance message. Be prepared to experiment. That would be my
Thank you so much. I've so enjoyed our conversation. That was really fun, as I knew it would be. Thank you very much, Keith.
I hope it's been of use. I'm sorry I've waffled on a few times. My apologies.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That's it for today's episode of Insights from the Coalface, Elevating Leadership Beyond the Boardroom. I hope this conversation left you with fresh insights, new perspectives, and a deeper connection to the challenges and opportunities of leadership. If you found value in today's discussion, I'd love for you to share it with your network, leave a review, or reach out to me with your thoughts. Leadership can be a lonely road, but it doesn't have to be. Let's keep learning, growing, and supporting each other. Until next time, stay resilient, stay authentic, and keep leading with purpose.